How's it, sports fans? Welcome back to the channel. If you are listening to this in December, man, we've had a big year and we are still delivering some episodes before you guys all go on Christmas break. Everyone subscribed on YouTube. Thanks so much. I read every single comment. I read every single review. So if you're doing those, thanks so much. I try to respond to as many as humanly possible. But what's surprising is a lot of you guys are listening quite regularly, but it says you're not subscribed. So if you could do me a favor, it'd be great to do that. But you're not here to listen to me. I've got someone that I connected before I went and did Mega Avalanche this year. And thank goodness I did, because it was exciting to try some new things. It was exciting to get in shape again and learn a lot more. I've been very lucky and privy to work with some amazing coaches. And Jamie Reed of Athlete Optimization is a high performance coach, and he's got an illustrious career even before jumping into MTB coaching. And he's going to, trust me, talk way over my pay grade, but I'm going to slow him down and get him to explain some things, because I think we can all definitely benefit from it. But Jamie, welcome to the show. I'm glad we are finally doing a recording, because some of those conversations we had over the phone, I wish we had recorded, because I learned so much. And I think I was pushing you to think outside the box as well, I hope. But you are doing your master's in technically an MTB sort of thesis field, correct?
Yeah, so just to kind of, and obviously thank you for having me on. Just to kind of let everyone know maybe a little bit more about where I'm at and obviously where it came from. So, like Andrew said, currently doing my Masters of Science degree in Sports and Performance Coaching. I do come from a very traditional strength and conditioning background, British weightlifting background, CrossFit background. Prior to that, obviously ex-military, but where I'm hoping to sort of shoot for next will hopefully be a PhD, and this is where kind of like my master's research, this is where it all kind of begins for me, is right here. I want to really understand more about the demands of the gravity disciplines such as downhill and enduro. It's just not well researched and not well documented at the moment, and like Andrew said, we've had some pretty amazing sort of conversations that we should have recorded, I think. And I always like questions, I like questions to kind of get my brain sort of thinking, but that's where I'm currently at, and hopefully I can spend this next year putting my master's research project together with the aim and intention of creating a coaching module for gravity disciplines such as downhill and enduro.
That's super interesting, because I think we've got some fascinating minds that are passionate about mountain biking, downhill. But correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it's that well publicized. That information often stays between coach and athlete and then gets passed on from an athlete maybe to a little youngster that he's helping out. I can see myself doing that. But I mean, in other sports, you've got probably journals and books and just so much more information and correct information that's probably more certified, I guess, more structured.
Yeah, I think that's, like I say, I've been coaching MTB athletes for a while now, probably going on five years at the moment. And one of the sort of things that stuck out to me was, as a strength and conditioning coach, particularly if you're aligned with like a national governing body, so like the UK SCA, which is here in the UK, I can access the archives and journals. So if I'm working with a rugby player or a golf player or someone from football or tennis, I can kind of access this huge library of, research and studies done on particular exercises, programs, structure. And then that allows me to deliver this, high performance coaching that we all want to deliver, and also to ensure the athlete is doing the correct thing. But when it comes to downhill and enduro, it's kind of like there's nothing there. And there are a few studies done. There was one done from Edinburgh Napier University. I think one was done in Spain, and maybe another done in America, that I could find like only 3 or 4 genuine studies. And even then, they weren't anything, spectacular. I mean, but most of them are old as well. So a lot of the modern sort of technologies that we have available now, they probably didn't have access to back then. So it kind of makes it hard to decide how are we going to train downhill and MTB athletes. And I guess right now a lot of coaches just coach of what they believe. I mean, which is great. You know, some people are doing some great things, some people are doing some poor things. That's just the way the world is. But to have no genuine understanding of the demands of the sport, to literally have nothing there, to have no research to really understand what that athlete is going through in something like downhill or enduro is beyond me at this point. So I'm hopefully going to take that among myself and try and put something together that hopefully a lot of coaches, athletes, teams can hopefully use, you know, moving forward. That's the whole aim of the game of what I'm trying to do here.
So the aim, if I understand correctly, is try to get some more scientific, concrete data that is then maybe, as they say, often like peer reviewed and accepted. Because now, like you say, I've worked with some coaches doing incredible work, and we did lactic acid tests after runs. Like, we're trying to use the scientific data, but no one's gone out of their way for the greater good of the industry potentially to try to say, cool, let's really try and get some, like, this is what scientific facts are for what the sort of challenges are of the sport, and maybe what we could learn from that. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah. So in order to getting something published is actually a pretty big task. It's not a small task. So the study has to kind of go through a whole process where it's validated. So for instance, if you wanted to use a particular exercise, that has to be validated. If you want to use a particular structure, it has to be validated. The actual model in which you choose to coach on has to be validated. And then it would go forward to like a board, usually from one of the universities, and then they would have to sign off on it and say, yeah, we're happy for you to conduct this research. Then you'd have to conduct the research, ensuring that everything is, you know, ticked off by the book. Then it has to be put out for, you know, peer-to-peer review. And if you're lucky and everything goes well, you'll eventually end up with a published research project that is then validated essentially. And then you can, you know, at that point you could then say, yep, doing this particular exercise at this particular point in the training program is validated. You know, look, here's the research. Let's do it because we know it works. Whereas, like I say, right now, we're kind of just guessing. And I think that's the whole thing that I can't really get my head around. I really do struggle to get my head around this idea that we're essentially coaching blind. There is no roadmap. There is no real understanding. And I'm obviously, once again, I'm pretty sure we'll get into it and please try to rein me back when I get a bit too carried away, because I do have a tendency to do that. But what I mean by we have no real understanding, you know, it's not just about strength. You know, there are physiological components, there are psychological components, there are environmental components that will affect how well an athlete can perform. And then you have to break each one of those, you know, factors down and analyze each one of them. So it's not just a case of saying, well, the athlete's not strong enough, or having more strength enables an athlete to control the bike better. We don't actually know if that's true or not. And once again, we can say, well, in regards to strength training or resistance training, if a person is stronger, they're less likely to be injured. Well, once again, no, we don't. We don't actually know that if a person is stronger, that they are less likely to be injured. We can say that there's a good chance that in terms of resistance training and its injury prevention sort of methods, that's correct. But essentially what we're saying there is, if a person does a decent amount of resistance training or even a little bit of resistance training, they're less likely to injure themselves in training, not necessarily in the sport that they do. Hence why rugby players, albeit very strong, very powerful people, still get injured. It's not there to prevent injury from their sport. It's to prevent injury more from a training standpoint. You know, so once again, there's this whole multifaceted approach to developing, you know, athletes to compete in a high performance environment. It's not just, you know, one singular thing or a couple of little things.
That is, I mean, I'm not surprised no one else is doing this, because it's a mouthful. And like you say, there's not even a guarantee. But would you say, because there are so many nuances in our sport, you know, from mental to the course changing to everyone's body being different, like there is no cookie cutter exact example of what a perfect athlete would look like. They come in all shapes and sizes, which is just so fascinating about our sport and many other sports. Don't get me wrong, like sports in general. But what are some misconceptions that might annoy some other coaches? Not that that's our goal, but you really digging deep into maybe some potential misconceptions that you're starting to prove otherwise. We've got, I think, a sport that is newer than, say, road cycling, and we've just sort of inherited some ways to train there. Then we've seen, well, being stronger is certainly helpful in other sports, so let's add that aspect. And we have like a mismush of sort of ways to train. So what's like a surprising misconception that you're starting to see from old studies and try learn?
Um, it's good. It's a good question. That is a good question. I don't even know if it's misconception. Maybe that's one way to put it. But arguably, the MTB industry leans heavily on resistance training. And when I say resistance training, I'm talking about strength training, going to the gym, lifting weights, lifting heavy, being strong. Being strong is it's not a performance indicator. It's not a performance benchmark, and one of the reasons I think I say that is just exactly as you've just said. Athletes come in all shapes and sizes. They're not all equally strong. They're not all equally squatting and deadlifted and bench lifting, the same as each other. So I don't think we can use the sort of this idea that strength training, or resistance training, as I like to call it, or how it should be known, is as resistance training. I don't think we can use that to say, well, if we make a person stronger in terms of their 1 rep max, so if we can make a person squat more, bench more, and deadlift more, does that then make them perform better on the bike? At this moment in time, I don't think so. And the reason being is you just have to look at all the sort of world champs. They come in all different, or who's capable of winning a World Cup. They all come in different shapes and sizes. Not one of them's the same. And once again, I'd put money on it. If you got them all in the gym, they're all squatting and deadlifting and bench pressing different weights. They're not all across the board the same. So I don't think we can use strength as a performance indicator or a benchmark in which to aim off. I think there are far more interesting and far more trackable and trainable metrics that people should be focusing on.
So what about as devil's advocate to say, but surely it doesn't hurt to be stronger, right? And then what about power to weight ratio, right? So different athletes, but I'm never gonna squat as much as a strong Loic Bruni or something, something like that. So is that something that you look at just on this topic, and then devil's advocate to say, well, surely it won't hurt your performance? But I think I'm hearing like maybe there's other aspects, if you focus on them more, they would give you better performance gains. I think that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, no, for sure. And yeah, you're right. Look, like I say, let's just focus on the physical components of, high performance right now. And, you have an athlete that comes to you and, they're 70 kilos, say, and they are squatting, a decent amount, and they are bench pressing a decent amount and deadlifting a decent amount. It's not quite potentially double their body weight. They're not quite bench pressing their body weight, but it's close. It's pretty close. They're relatively strong for their weight, say. It's not gonna harm them, no. And that's exactly where you want them to be. You want a person to be strong to their weight, say. They don't have to be, Olympic lifting strong. They don't have to be, strongman strong, or interested, in like powerlifting and stuff like that. But they have to be sort of relatively strong to the weight. But it certainly won't hinder their performance. But once again, time is the enemy of everybody. You only have roughly 6 months between when the season finishes to it starts again. That is not a long time. That is a short amount of time. And if that is the short window in which we're operating in, focusing on increasing their squat, deadlift, or bench by even 5 or 10% you're not going to see, in my opinion, you're not going to see a great deal of performance benefits from that, and neither will the athlete.
That's probably quite a controversial an opinion, I would think. But I think we joked about it. I think we're seeing more of that on social media because it's cooler to post that you're in the gym than on your watt bike doing some of the other work. So yeah, I mean, start opening up to what you're starting to find, what you're working on. Some of the stuff we started testing. Like I say, I've done my fair share of VO2 max and these intervals, and I do agree that it is a newer view on downhill is to incorporate the weight training. Definitely, I can compare my earliest training programs to probably some of my later ones. There was a good mix, but I understand what you're saying and saying, like, be careful if you focus so much on that. And that was quite interesting in cross country. Someone would be like, look, you could work your ass off to get a percentage better on the climb, and that's a second, 2 seconds, whatever it is. I can get you that on the downhill tomorrow if we go and work on your skills. Like, what should we be working on? Even though cross country, you would think it's the engine, right?
Yeah.
It's always the engine. It's like, well, free time, you could also get some free time on the downhill, and that doesn't mean you would, neglect the engine.
I'm slowly trying to process how we can articulate this well.
Okay.
So I think, like I said, what you have to understand is that performance in itself isn't one singular component. It is multifaceted. There are a lot of other metrics and components that we can talk about. So I'll quickly sort of spiel off a few of them. So physiology is something that we really need to tap into, and when we look at, physiology in sports in particular, what I have been looking at recently is things like VO2 max, maximal lactate steady state, fat max, carb max, muscle oxygen saturation, and basically all things lactate dynamics. So that's how we can then work out, just like you said, does a person have a big enough engine? How do we measure the engine? Well, we measure it in VO2 max. Okay, higher the VO2 max, higher the engine.
Can you define that a little bit more on the layman terms? Because people might have heard VO2 max and heard of that horrendous test, but could you simplify that for us?
Yeah. So all essentially VO2 max is it's your body's ability to uptake oxygen. So as we breathe in, as we're starting to work out, how much oxygen can we essentially breathe in and utilize? And the key component there is utilize, because you have a difference between peak oxygen uptake and VO2 max. So all we are essentially trying to work out there is how much oxygen can your body effectively breathe in, send to the working muscle groups, and utilize. And that'll give us something called VO2 max. And that is the gold standard for your aerobic capacity, your aerobic engine. That is, the higher that is, the better it is. And actually, I'm at that stage in my life where VO2 max is arguably the biggest performance indicator across any sport, any discipline. Really? Yeah, it is one of the, and not just that. I mean, once again, I could get carried away, and I'm trying not to. It's also the longevity element of it. The higher that is.
I was going to say, how about it's like a longevity drug, is it not?
Oh, totally. Like, there is no better health benchmark on this planet right now than VO2 max. You can go and have all your tests done, your blood tests, your vitamin tests, your scans, whatever, bone density, whatever it may be. But the biggest indicator of longevity, as well as it being a high performance sort of measurement as well, is VO2 max. The higher that is, the longer you're going to live.
Yeah. Do you follow? I'm going to get the Peter Attil. Yeah. He's kind of known as a longevity doctor within lack of a better term, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And he's fascinating to listen to on the VO2, right? And his grip strength. He says that grip strength's also like a big determining factor. But that's like, he's talking more on aging people that are stopping resistance training.
Yeah,
And you're not saying don't do resistance training because VO2 is far more important. Um, but he's so big on that.
yeah, definitely. And once again, you don't have to just take my word for it. I would always advocate for people to, whenever you hear things like this, look, we live in a day and age where you have access to the internet. Just go and type that in on Google, do some research, have a little look, and you'll see it's not just me. You'll see it's not just Peter. You'll see that there's loads of other people out there that are advocating for this. We just tend to be a bit naive to it, I think, more than anything.
Well, it's quite a horrible type of training in my mind to do. But if you said to someone on your deathbed, like, what would you give up to have some more days? What would you give up to have a longer life? And some high intensity interval training 3 times a week or twice a week or even once compared to nothing is better, correct? But I don't want to steal the conversation. Maybe that's an awesome way to like explain how you increase it. Explain what aerobic is versus anaerobic. Because people may have heard the terms and who knows, they're getting into riding and they're like, yeah, I want to be stronger, fitter, and be able to ride for longer and it'll be safer out on the trail and I'll go quicker.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to warn quickly on that, increasing a person's oxygen consumption and uptake isn't just around the high intensity intervals. It also needs to be matched with a lot of long, slow distance, keeping your heart rate between that like 130, 140 mark, plus 2 interval sessions a week, which, as you say, there's no getting away from it. They're horrendous, regardless of which ones you do. I've done 2x8s, it's horrendous. I've done 4x5s, it's horrendous. I've done 3x5s, it's horrendous. I've done hard starts into VO2 max intervals, it's horrendous. I've done 40-20s. None of them get any easier.
No, and the fitter you get, you just go faster. So it's like they never get easier. The steady long rides get a bit easier. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. You get to do some steady rides where you're not allowed to raise your heart rate too high. So that's cool. Yeah. That's a start. Yeah. Remember when I text you, I was like, what do you want the wattage to be? And you're like, nope, you read it correct. It needs to be that. I'm like, oh my God, what did I sign up for? But you do feel better the minute that last interval stops. It's like a weight. You feel so good. You really do. Mentally, physically, it really is amazing.
Yeah, not that I wanted to veer too much off topic just yet, but
why not? It's a podcast. I think that's what we're meant to do.
There's a whole psychological component there that is truly, truly fascinating and something I'm a huge, huge fan of. And maybe that's my military background, but there's only one way to become more mentally robust, and ultimately, our young athletes or aspiring athletes or athletes are going to be competing in really harsh environments. It's the only way to describe them, competition environments. There's a lot of pre-race anxiety. There's a lot of second-guessing thoughts racing through the head, slightly elevated heart rates, not a good night's sleep, operating in, their bodies are suboptimal, and then to be able to come out with a championship, winning run or to stand on that podium, you have got to be so well mentally conditioned to be able to achieve that. And I'll be honest with you, the only way you're going to get to that level of mental robustness is doing things that you hate. It's the only way to do it. It's the only way we know how to do it. If you get up every day and do something you hate, well, slowly but surely you become, more mentally robust. You become tougher. But it's also a way of developing courage, which I think is super important for people to understand. Courage is something that a lot of high performance athletes need to develop. And what I mean by that is we can often be ruined by our own internal dialogue, especially pre-race anxiety can get the better of a lot of people. The jitters, the 101 thoughts that's going through the head every minute. To be able to face up to that and truly make sense of it and calm the mind down. It's not just about mindfulness, but it's about mental robustness and how strong and how willing you are and having a bit of courage to stand up to your own fears, because that's essentially what pre-race anxiety is. It's just fear. So it's a very brave thing to do as well.
Yeah, I mean that's very well put in, and I am so on top of that topic of doing hard things builds resilience. It's a
Hmm.
muscle. If you follow some of the guys we probably do follow, the guy Huberman, well, they've done huge podcasts on it, and you should probably go and download them. It's an actual part of the brain they feel, right? And you're going to correct me because I'm not the scientist, I'm not the coach, and it just makes so much sense when they describe it from a scientific background. You have to do hard stuff to literally work out that muscle to then be able to do more hard stuff, and you get fulfillment from that. And that's in everyday life as well as an athlete. Like the reason Greg Minnaar, I mean, I had a podcast with him that'll come out later than this, but he was so doubtful that he had enough skill, and he just put himself in uncomfortable situations from such a young age. He doubted himself. He doubted that he'd have a career in downhill. Would you
Hmm.
think the GOAT would doubt? No one from the outside would think that he has fears, that he has doubts. But because he's able to put himself, like you say, have courage to put himself in uncomfortable situations so often, then you normalize that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll say this, and I'll only ever say it once. I think hopefully everybody will hear it. Everybody's scared, right? Like, regardless of who you are. I know some of the baddest people in the world, and I can tell you straight away they were scared. Everyone gets scared, and
You mean like from your military background you referencing?
yeah, yeah,
Really?
100%. Yeah, I know guys that I serve with. I know guys that I worked with as private security contractors on some risky, remote parts of the world where, we've been terrified, like, I mean, genuinely terrified, but the ability to be able to do the task, that doesn't come from, mindfulness. And I'm not bashing mindfulness here. I practice mindfulness, every day as it stands now. But the reason why we get up and are still able to do these seemingly impossible things in the most remote parts of the world isn't because we're, some esoteric like creatures. We are just well conditioned. We, through training and through a long period of time, your mind gets conditioned to do things that you don't want to do. I don't want to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go for a run, but we'll get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and we'll go for a run. I don't want to be in the middle of the jungle in South America for 6 weeks and be in wet clothes and not have a shower for over a month and not have hot food for over a month, but you're still able to repetitively do those tasks. And I asked myself this question for a very, very long. I didn't see it because I was so young, but how is it that you're able to take these young men, because that's what we all are, we're all very young at this point, and how are you able to take these young people, send them to anywhere in the world, and I mean anywhere, into some of the worst environments and worst conditions, and have them operate at the highest level, and yeah, the physical components are there. We were physically robust, but it's more the mental robustness. And it all stems down to what we did every day. You got up every day and you did things that you don't want to do. And you really can't underestimate how powerful that is. It just has such a profound effect on the mind. Because then, eventually when something difficult does come, to be honest with you, it's actually not that difficult,
Because you've
And
done so many difficult tasks leading up to that. So then it's just another difficult task, right?
yeah, so bringing it back to Greg, I mean, Greg will have probably he'll have had that feeling in his stomach for so long. I mean, how would he know if that's not normal? To him, that like pre-race jitters, the pre-race anxiety, at a time in his life, yeah, that will have maybe consumed him, right? But over time, and working on that and listening to that, it probably just got normal for him to the point where he can be like, yeah, this is normal. Whereas I think a lot of people that are new to racing really struggle with that. And that's one of the things that I do think really struggle with, is how do they calm the voice down? That internal dialogue is the ultimate enemy, man. Like, everyone knows it. If you've ever been in a hard place, or in between a rock and a hard place, if you sat and actually listened to yourself, if you could write those thoughts down on a piece of paper, they are horrible, horrible thoughts to have. And to overcome that, like I say, It takes some education. You need to be educated on why these thoughts influence our feelings. You need to kind of understand a bit more about, like I say, anxiety, which is our fight or flight response. You know, you need to it's not all from the amygdala, by the way, which is what everyone kind of thinks, but you know, you need to understand a bit more about the fight or flight system, what it's really doing. In its easiest form, it's just dumping adrenaline into your body. And that's where we get them weird sort of like tingly sensations in the hands. Maybe you get a bit shaky. Maybe your legs don't feel as solid when you're standing on them. Your stomach churns. You know, all those sort of wonderful feelings. I mean, they're not wonderful, but they are, you know, from that aspect. Once you understand that all it is really is your body has just dumped a whole load of adrenaline, and you can go, okay, I'm anxious. And also accepting the fact that you're anxious. The worst thing you can do is try and fight it as well. And everyone knows that from a psychological, you know, component. If you start telling yourself, I'm not anxious, I'm not scared, I'm not afraid, and then you've got all these weird sensations going on, your mind is ultimately going to go, well, if you're not anxious, then there must be something wrong. And essentially what the mind does is it either looks externally for threats, and if it can't find anything external, it'll look internal. And then that's when you start hearing about people saying, oh, oof, my heart rate, you know, my heart rate's up a bit, you know, I don't really feel that well. And it's like, it's just adrenaline. That's all your body's doing. It's just sent a wee signal because of a thought, and it's all influenced by a thought. And then the moment that thought kicks off, it dumps that adrenaline, your body goes into overdrive. And honestly, it can be chaos trying to work your way through that on your own. But with a bit of education and a bit of time and a bit of understanding of realizing, well, actually, yeah, I'm anxious. Okay, I know why I'm feeling shaky now, and that's not a problem, and accepting it. And actually, the quicker you can accept that you're anxious, the quicker usually anxiety sort of disappears.
Geez, that's fascinating. What are some sort of conversations you have with athletes? I understand we've still got some topics to get back to, but we will.
Yeah, I know.
This one's so fascinating because I think everyone feels this in all walks of life, whether it's sport or a job interview or potentially public speaking,
Podcast.
all those things. Like, it's podcast. Yeah, I was a lot more nervous for my first podcast than whatever. This is 140 odd. Definitely. Absolutely. And it's doing those reps. I like to call it reps. And that's why I think some sportsmen can go over and do other things because they know what the blueprint is. It's actually not rocket science.
No.
It's doing the reps. It's doing hard things. It's sacrificing. And then you do get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's what Greg was. Just comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because I picked his brain. I'm like, dude, it's tough for me racing at home. I wanted to perform. My family was there. Obviously, that's the race I want to do well at. There's more distractions. And you just seem to just excel there. I think there was a bit of chemical difference between our brains. I do think that his process needed to be different to mine to perform at an optimum level. And that's back to, there's no one size fits all. But yeah, so you're working holistically with your athletes on this physical side. But you're not ignoring the mental side. You can do all the work you want, but if the mental side is not quite there that day, that can be the deterrent of good results.
100%. I mean, look, you cannot underestimate the power of the mind as such. And for all the training in the world, for all the time in the gym, for all the VO2 max intervals, for all the the lactate samples, for all the SMO2 samples, if a person does not have that psychological edge, they will not be able to perform. It's arguably, it's up there as one of the most crucial components that a person can develop. And like I say, you know, some people are more mentally robust. I have seen that. Some people have the ability to, kind of shake it off, and some people don't. And
genetically, you're of the belief that they're born with a little bit more, or that's part of their personality traits that they can handle certain things.
Yeah. So once again, not to get overly, crazy on the subject, but environmental factors basically shape how we interpret things. So this can go right back to early age, and it could even be that your parents were. And by the way, anxiety is a relatively new thing, in terms of how we speak about it in this modern day and age. Our parents, probably never spoke about it. Well, in fact, my mum did. My mum's a psychologist, and so is my dad. So, I have a good understanding of what they do, and this was always a big thing in our house. But it wasn't something that was talked about a lot back in the day, and therefore, if your mother was anxious and you were at home and you were a wee boy or a wee lass, you'll have picked up on the fact that she was anxious subconsciously, and maybe she didn't know how to process that, and maybe your dad didn't know how to process that, and that can sometimes come across as whether they were angry or upset, a bit more. If you grow up in that type of environment, you're going to be subjected to most likely experiencing anxiety, in your sort of teens or your early 20s. Versus if you grow up in a house and, the family's, well educated on what anxiety feels like and what it does and how that shapes the environment in which you grow up in that household, there's also good evidence at the moment to suggest that you're not going to most likely be one of those anxious people. And that's the reason why I think anxiety is, huge in today's age. Almost everybody I speak to has some form of daily anxiety, whether it be, GAD, which is generalized anxiety disorder, or some people have panic disorder, and some people have phobias. Phobias are a big thing. People are afraid of planes, cats, dogs. They're actually all a form of, anxiety. It's a really big, once again, fascinating topic.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing some light on that. I mean, and to me, I kind of look at it as you're anxious about a future problem, correct? If I mean, I'm dumbing it down to the, in a race would be you're anxious, you're fearful of the race, the outcome. Are you going to crash? Are you going to perform? There's all these things that I guess, yeah, with thought and proper process, you can control or at least accept, deal with it. Everyone has it. Like if we get back to the performance side and your athletes, like, and maybe then move on to, your big passion is obviously trying to figure out how to train for these things, and part of me thinks if you do the work and your training is correct, like I think that's a pill to help as well. Not a pill, literally, but figuratively. Like if I get to a race and I've done the work, I'm more sort of comfortable, confident, that hopefully with the correct processes, it'll unfold closer to what I want because I've done the work.
Yeah, I mean, it's all building blocks. Like you say, if you know, and this is what the great thing about performance testing is, and why I do advocate for a larger sort of scope of performance testing. Because if you're basing things off just, 6-second power test, and you're basing things off an FTP test or critical power test, and then having sort of strength elements there, like your sort of 3 or 1 rep max, if they don't increase that much across that short scope of board. So, for instance, if you've got an athlete, let's call it athlete A, and as a coach, all you're doing is measuring functional threshold power over a 20-minute test, and you manage their strength, and what you're looking at is their 1 rep max across a back squat, a deadlift, and a bench press. They've only got 2 things that they can realistically improve on. And if they don't improve on the 2 things, well, that's drastic for their confidence, because now they're like, oh, well, my performance hasn't increased. I clearly haven't got any better, which obviously means my race results are not going to be any better. And already they're on the back foot psychologically. Whereas, like I say, when you can include a multifaceted, broad range of, sort of performance, i.e., did their strengths get a bit better? Potentially, can you measure that a bit better? Did muscular endurance get better? Did their VLA, for instance, their VLA max, did that come down or did that come up because both the performance increase? Did their VO2 increase? Did their oxygen consumption at anaerobic threshold increase? Their VO2 max might have not increased, but their oxygen consumption at anaerobic threshold increased. That's a performance indicator. Their ability to utilize fat as a fuel source, is that better? Brilliant, outstanding. Their ability to consume a higher amount of carbohydrates, per hour, did that increase? Perfect. Did they? And what this means, what all of this really means, is they have the ability to concentrate more. They have more energy on board. Their ability to utilize fuel is better. Their ability to, contract muscle fibers is better. There's a huge there's a huge element within all of that testing that you can then say, well, your performance is night and day from where it was. Whereas if you've got a very sort of minimalistic approach to testing and they don't really increase across those things, you have the potential to ruin a person's psychology before they even begin. And it's something that I like to tell all my athletes that, that I do work with, and I do spend a lot of time, working with them psychologically, and speaking with them and letting them know that, yeah, look, your performance, and I have never not increased anyone's performance. I have always made people fitter, faster, stronger, and I'm quite, and that isn't like some bold statement to say that I can do this across the board, regardless of who it is. It just means that I have such a wide net of metrics that I do track that I can honestly say that every single person I've worked with, I've made their performance, their physical performance better. Have I helped people psychologically? Yes, I do help people try and process, racing down. Maybe someone has a terrible race run. And this brings me to another point. If all you're looking at is time, as to how well that athlete performed, how do you then debrief them the day after the race? So I have this whole process. It's essentially a bunch of questionnaires that they answer pre-race and post-race. And I think it's super important for an external coach to have that ability to do so. Because if an athlete has a terrible run, they'll just come down and tell you, look, I've had a terrible run. My ride was shit. I did terrible. That's that. And they're left with that feeling of, feeling bad because they didn't perform the way they wanted to. Whereas if you can then break it down to how were you feeling physically? Physically, I felt strong. How did you feel nutritionally? I probably could have ate a bit more. How was the bike setup? I'll be honest with you, man. I think my fork pressures were a bit too high, up front. Wasn't quite happy with them. Track conditions. How did you favour the track conditions? I don't like the rain. Okay, perfect. Where were you mentally? Out of 10, I was a 7. Now, all of a sudden, when it comes to Monday's debrief, and they say, I just had a terrible run, and you pull up the sheet and you go, yeah, I'm not surprised. Like, all of these things are suboptimal. How can you expect, at the end of the day, if you want to win a World Cup now, you have to have the best week, let alone the best day before. Everything has to be working for you, in order for you to get that 1%, because ultimately that's what we're after, right? Like, there is no huge margins in downhill anymore. There isn't huge margins in enduro either. We're talking about 1%. And it's like, well, where do you find that 1%? And I like to use this story. So prior to 2007 British cycling, they brought in a new sports scientist, head of sports science, and he came in and he didn't even look at anything physical. He looked at their skin suits. He used a different material. He looked at their bikes. He got them a better bike fit. They spent hours in the wind tunnel. He painted the interior of the bus white so that they could spot dust in case there was any dust, because that would affect, obviously, the air, the quality of the air inside the bus. They measured the thickness of the pillows, so that they could have each person had individual pillows so that when they slept with these pillows so that they were in an optimal position for sleep. We haven't even touched on anything physical. And that year we took the most Olympic medals. I think it was Beijing.
No way.
So what I mean is, while you're focusing on all of these, physical components, don't forget the psychological components, the environmental components, and don't allow, any athlete to kind of dictate what their performance was, because like I say, it's just human nature. They'll automatically go to, well, it was terrible. When chances are there are probably a lot of things that could have been better, and that's what you need to find out.
Yeah, I mean that's the same with bike setup. It feels shit. Can we define that?
Yeah.
What are you really feeling? Because how are we going to then isolate the problem? And that's amazing. Same performance, and we will go straight to I wasn't fast enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not fit enough, or whatever it may be. And I think that's key. Yes, to break down. Okay, but what was your self-talk before the run? Can you even remember it? Could you write it down? That wasn't optimum. Or like you say, some weeks just don't go that well preparation wise, out of your control as well, right?
Yeah.
And I think the best are able to really, really, really be truthful on what they can control and not control, and
Hmm.
not let the things out of their control affect them, right?
No, I mean, and that's such a huge important. It's a huge important thing to understand that there are always going to be things that you can't control, and most of them are actually environmental sort of components, if I'm honest. So there are always going to be things that you can't control, and yes, we should try our best to control the things that we can control. And this brings us to the whole, and this part is mindfulness, but is being present as well. You know, like you say, everyone's too focused on you finish one race and you're already thinking about the next race, let alone the next. You know, try and focus on today and just what you're doing today. And if you can keep that, going through the week of just focusing on the day and focusing on the day, rather than worrying about this thing that's 1 week down the line, because it'll just build up to be this bigger and bigger monster in your head, rather than just focusing on, right, cool, tomorrow I'm going to go to the gym, then I'm going to do a nice recovery session, Wednesday I'm going to have the day off, I'm going to go for a walk and have some nice food, ensure that you're getting enough rest. Those are all things that you can control. You can control and dictate how your week goes. You can't control the weather. You can't control track conditions. And we do need to spend some more time, and it's an interesting topic as well, but we need to spend some more time on bike setup and optimizing not just bike setup, but our body position and where does that bike put us, in terms of our position. So there's a lot of work for them to do, other than just worry about the race that's a week, you know, down the line.
I have to tell you about AG1. You are probably not eating enough fruits and vegetables, and you know it. I've always taken my health seriously during my racing days and even now, but I often miss the mark on nutrition, especially when I'm traveling or busy. AG1 makes the best daily foundational nutrition supplement that I have ever found. One scoop of AG1 contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including multivitamins, prebiotics, probiotics, and more, all of which work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet and increase energy and focus. They also aid with digestion and support a healthy immune system, all without the need to take multiple products or pills. I seriously look forward to in the morning. It takes all of 60 seconds to mix and drink. Best of all, there is a 90-day money-back guarantee. So if you're skeptical or not sure, you can just buy it and try it for 3 full months. And if you don't like it for any reason, they will give your money back. So if you want to replace your multivitamin and more, start with AG1. Right now, try AG1 and get a free bottle of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase at drinkag1.com/moving the needle. That's a $48 value for free if you go to drinkag1.com/moving the needle, or by going to the link in the show notes below. What is that? That was fascinating when we started speaking about body position, and we mustn't obviously forget to come back to maybe the aerobic and anaerobic. But you mentioned it, body position. Even these sort of things, you're starting to help people understand that could lead to more fatigue or lead to arm pump in some athletes.
Yeah, this expanded into quite the topic, and I'm still slowly trying to figure it out. But for instance, if I was able to attach a couple of sensors to an individual, and I could tell that they were prematurely fatiguing on a downhill run, there are essentially two things that you can then do. You can say, well, the person isn't conditioned enough. Okay, so that's the first place you'd probably start. Maybe you'd go, well, the person isn't fit enough, it's not conditioned enough, and that's what you need to work on. There's also this huge, which is outside sort of my realm of knowledge. So I've been speaking to Geordie from Fox about this, and there is this huge element about bike setup, body position. Can we get you as an individual into an optimal, position? And for instance, can we influence suspension characteristics? So if we know you are carrying slightly more fatigue coming into the last race of the weekend, can we then optimize the bike to then sort of alleviate some of that fatigue? And that's where sort of these muscle oxygen saturation data and muscle oxygen saturation sensors do come in, particularly useful. Now what we can do is we can analyze, from a downhill run, essentially what you'll see, you would strap a sensor, say, to the quad on the leg. You'd put one potentially on the upper arm, and then what you can see is during a downhill run, you'll kind of see these. It's like an SMO2 line, but you'll see this sort of come down. And what we're really looking to do is how far does that come down? If it comes down to detrimental values, which I'll be honest with you, it does at the moment. There isn't one person I've tested, including elite level athletes, that this doesn't happen. So it comes down to what we call, a drastic level. And all that essentially means is your working muscle no longer has oxygen available, and that's when we see a huge rise in sort of lactate. And that's when we end up with this sort of pain in our legs, if you want to call it that. And then what will happen is your hips have to ultimately come up to try and stretch the legs out, right, to try and alleviate some of that tension, because we're in this isometric hold. Well, the problem with that is your hips rise, your body weight shifts forward, and now all of a sudden you've got this sort of weight resting on your arms. And that's where we hear a lot about forearm pump or upper body fatigue, because actually your body is now tilted slightly, your weight's slightly shifted, and you're putting more pressure on the front. So you can turn around and say it's a conditioning problem, but ultimately as well, the bike, the suspension, and how it's set up will influence the body position on whether or not we can also alleviate fatigue, but also push it back to a further point in time, which is what we're trying to do through both conditioning the athlete and looking at the bike setup.
That's so interesting, because you would think that the arms were the issue there, right? And you're saying, well, potentially if you look at it, the legs have fatigued first. And if they hadn't fatigued, then maybe your arms wouldn't feel the way they feel. Like that's the symptom comes out in the arms. But the cause, like in injury, anything, there's like effect and a cause, right? Was actually the legs, from conditioning to bike setup. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, and it's not just, and I guess like some people will be sitting here listening right now thinking, well, great, I'll just go and do more squats and I'll build the world's most bulletproof legs anyone's ever seen, and that way my legs won't fatigue. I wish that was the case, but it's not, because like I say, one of the problems that you have is that the working muscle, i.e. the legs, because you are in this isometric hold, and a lot of your weight is centered through your legs as you push down, and just in the isometric hold that we tend to ride in. So, yes, will increase in strength help that? Actually, no, it won't, but increase in muscular endurance will. So like, instead of focusing on trying to increase a 3-rep max, you might want to do submaximal loaded work, so call it 65% of your 3-rep max. How many reps can you do in terms of a back squat? That's something else that you could look to sort of train, I guess. But one of the other elements here, and I think this is the root cause of it, is it might be your oxygen uptake and delivery. So, for instance, you might not have the highest oxygen consumption and uptake. So your VO2 max might be too low for the type of work that you want to do, because obviously the more oxygen you can, essentially breathe in, the more that is delivered to the working muscle groups. But there is also a bottleneck. Like I say, you can also have a super high VO2 max and have terrible muscular conditioning. Both have to work in order for this delivery of oxygen to get to the working muscle group to stop that premature fatigue. It can't just be one or the other. You can't be in the gym all the time doing loads of reps and think, right, cool, I've been listening to Jamie, he said I need to do loads of reps, get my quads, get my hamstrings, get my glutes all fired up, well conditioned, and then have a suboptimal VO2 max. You've actually got no oxygen to deliver. And when you think about how many muscles are actually involved in stabilizing the bike and actually are in play during a downhill run, well, that oxygen's trying to get to all these different muscle groups. It's not just trying to get to the one. So while we can turn around and say, I personally believe, the root cause of arm pump is definitely a general lack of conditioning, and your legs maybe ain't conditioned enough. And who's to say what's enough? Like we hinted at the start of this podcast, there are no studies to suggest that anyone out there, even, people like Piron, even people like Bruni, there's nothing to really say that they are conditioned enough. They're winning, that's good, but we've got no benchmark to decide on, well, what is conditioned enough. We have no idea. And what is the right amount of oxygen consumption, or what is the sort of gold standard sort of oxygen uptake on downhill athletes? We don't know. So, while I'm sitting here saying all this, the reality is we don't know. But I can tell you from what I've seen using muscle oxygen saturation data, from what I've seen using portable metabolic carts, from what I've seen using lactate samples, GPS data, I can tell you that if a person doesn't have a high enough VO2 max, they're not going to be able to deliver the right amount of oxygen to the legs, and their legs will prematurely fatigue. Vice versa. I can also tell you if that person has little to no muscular endurance, localized muscular endurance in the legs, they are going to prematurely fatigue, regardless of their oxygen consumption.
So what do you think about, so I got tested for, and they called it compartment syndrome, like some runners get. Now I'm guessing that you're going to go, it's back to conditioning. But what about genetically guys are more susceptible to that than others? Like I remember Danny's like, I don't really get it. Greg mentioned he barely gets it. I think they're versions of fatigue, but I think if you feel my forearms compared to theirs, something else I think genetically was going on there. Well, at least it makes me feel better to know that I think there was.
I think,
And of course I could always be better conditioned. I could always have a higher VO2 max and better gym conditioning. But I think I did a fairly damn good job. I'm not sure that I left that much more on the table. Definitely there was maybe some more knowledge that wasn't there at the time. What do you think to that?
I mean, yeah, look, will genetics have some part to play in it? Potentially. What I will say is that we don't really know. And I'm always reminded of, you'll have heard the age-old argument around VO2 max. Everyone will say, oh, well, genetics limits your VO2 max. We think it does, but we don't actually know. And regardless of your age, weight, race, where you're from, it has been proven time and time again that you can increase your VO2 max regardless. So therefore, when it comes to, someone like yourself, do some people experience more arm pump than others? And is that genetic? Is that genetics? There's the potential that genetics could influence it. Of course there is. But I also always like to act on the side of, well, we can make things better regardless of our genetics. Because like I said, genetics can supposedly hamper VO2 max. And I say that very loosely. Yet regardless of your age, your race, where you're from in the world, you can increase VO2 max. So, you can always get better is what I'm trying to say. Now, does that better point? Does that mean that you then don't experience arm pump? I don't know. Some more time and research is needed there.
Yeah, but I like that thought process because it shouldn't be an excuse. That's you're like not leaving space for me to make an excuse and say, well, it is what it is. Like, well, you can always improve it like anything in life.
Totally.
You get dealt certain cards and there's always room for improvement. That's for sure. But it's just full circle back to what I can totally hear. Like you are aware that you don't know everything and you're trying to get more and more facts and information. But you seem very confident that it comes back to VO2 max. It's just such a secret. Well, it's not that secret, but it's just such an important aspect. Like it seems to me you like that is the holy grail done correctly.
Yeah, and I want to. This was the question that was on my mind this morning. It's like, how am I going to articulate this well enough that, hopefully some people can take something away from, because that's ultimately my intention here and just in general. I want to be. It's not like what I say is right. I just want people to be able to take some information back. And, on that point that you just made there, is VO2 max this ultimate defining, pinnacle metric that actually we all really need to be paying attention to? I'm inclined to say yes, but I'm also not, I guess, stupid enough to suggest that, well, if you don't have a high VO2 max, that you can't perform. because there is more to performance than VO2 max as well. But is it something that we all need to focus on? Absolutely. And if you have to ask me right now at this moment in time, and who knows where this might change next year, this might change in 2 years, the more I find out, because every day I'm finding something out. Every day something comes back and I'm like, that's different. That's not right. And it's not that it's not right, it's just different, should I say. If you had to ask me, what does the perfect, physiological profile of a downhill athlete need to be in order to win World Cups? Like, what does that really look like on paper? Like, tell me what that really looks like. You need to have an incredible lactate clearance rate. You need to be able to utilize lactate very efficiently. Your body, it needs to have a really high VO2 max, because VO2 max influences how much lactate you can clear. So, regardless of how well conditioned you are, if you can't clear enough lactate, you're just carrying fatigue over every run. So VO2 max needs to be high. You need to have an excellent set of lactate dynamics in both lactate accumulation rates and clearance rates. Your maximal lactate steady state, which is essentially a point in time after a certain amount of intensity that lactate just rises, detrimentally, that needs to be pushed back to a further point in time. And you need to be relatively strong. And then vice versa, for an enduro athlete, for instance, the VO2 max plays an even more crucial component, because, those guys and girls are out there, let's call it, anywhere from 4.5 to 5.5 hours. Only, roughly 20 to 25 minutes of that is actual racing. The rest of the time they're in liaisons. So what's crucial for them? Well, their ability to utilize fat as a fuel source, so that they're not just constantly burning carbohydrates. If they're constantly burning carbohydrates, chances are their nutritional program is not providing anywhere near enough carbohydrates to be able to sustain that output. So they need to have a better fat max, for instance. So fat max is essentially a power output where your body burns the most amount of fat and oxygen. So, for instance, if during a liaison, a typical liaison, your, say, power output is averaging 250 watts while you come from stage 2 to stage 3, and your fat max is 130 watts, well, guess what? You need glycogen to just get you through the liaison, let alone the downhill. When really what we want to see is that fat max, 200, 220, so that they're burning fat while going up the liaisons and keeping their glycogen stores for when they really need it. But one of the other crucial elements to this is, if you're working at fat max, you're not incurring any lactate. So you can actively recover. And this all comes back to VO2 max, lactate accumulation rate. The higher your VO2 max is, the higher most likely your lactate clearance rate will be, which means you can clear away more lactate in a less amount of time. And just to, while I'm on this, because I'm on a bit of a tangent, I understand, but if you imagine an athlete, say, incurs, something like just over 12 millimoles of lactate per litre, per minute per kilo during a downhill run. This is sticking to enduro on this example. And then they have a 45 to 50 minute liaison from stage 2 to stage 3. And they do not have a well-developed aerobic system. And they just have a well-developed anaerobic system. They're actually not going to have enough time to clear away the amount of lactate that's in their body. And in fact, what they will do is incur more lactate as they make their way up the hill. So while they do get a couple of minutes at the top and lactate levels can come back down, it's still a long time for the body to be working so hard to clear away all this lactate. And that's why we get fatigue in endurance sports. It's, metabolically, endurance athletes have to be super efficient at how they utilize fuel. And that's what we want to see in enduro athletes, bringing it back to downhill. And why might all this be important as well? Well, they're not just doing one run. It's this whole week. And if you really look at the whole week, and if you put a power meter on any of the top athletes there, and you look at the amount of kilojoules, which is essentially energy that they that they spend every day in the lead up to this one winning run on the Sunday. They've spent an incredible amount of energy. So it's like, how can you not turn around and say that's, if I had to look at that profile, I would say, yeah, that person's an endurance athlete. I wouldn't say they were a sprint discipline. I would say it's an endurance discipline. It's exactly what I would say.
Really,
So
that's super interesting when you
yeah,
articulate it like that. If you think about that, it's about having the most energy for the final run. It's a big week mentally, physically.
yeah, and especially
Okay.
when you take in, okay, let's just say you are anxious. Let's just say you are afraid. You're going to burn more energy, right? Naturally, it's just what your body does. And then, maybe you don't get the best sleep, so your body burns more energy again. And there are only two ways, I want to say this, that there are only two ways to provide power to the cranks to essentially turn the pedal. You can either do it mechanically, as in your body mechanically turns the pedal around, as in you push down on the pedal. And then most of us rely on metabolic. So you rely on energy. Like I say, in order for your muscle fibers to recruit, to contract, in order for you to turn the pedal, requires energy. And if all you're doing is relying on glycogen for that, by the time you get to Sunday, I find it very, very hard to understand how anyone could probably take on that amount of, glycogen and carbohydrates and calories all through the week. I would put money on it that most people are suboptimally, not in a nutritionally good place by Sunday.
So you can feel yourself through a week to help with using some of these different systems. Maybe this is a really good time to define those systems, layman's terms, for me
Yeah,
and other
I'll
people.
do my best.
I'm hoping I'm not the only one that's potentially, no, it's fascinating. But I think hearing glycogen, carbohydrates, we've heard, people have heard of zone 2 training and aerobic, anaerobic. Maybe if we could softly define those, for them to understand their training, and then maybe the systems that are getting used, and then the fuel that they might need. Because maybe there's aspiring people like, I'm loving my downhill racing, and shit, how do I eat better? How do I train better? Same as
Mm-hmm.
enduro. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe we define these terms that are out there.
Yeah, so I think here we go. I think the easiest way to kind of explain all this is your body has two energy pathways: the aerobic system, which is fat and oxygen, and that uses type 1 muscle fibers. So whenever you hear me refer to type 1, I'm referring to fat and oxygen. That's one energy system. That's the aerobic system. Then on the other side, you have the anaerobic system, which is type 2 fibers, and that uses glycogen. Now, glycogen is essentially, a sugar molecule. Carbohydrates is essentially what it is. So every time you think of doing something that's type 2 orientated, just think carbs. So anytime you do resistance training, it's type 2 orientated, you're using carbs. So your body, if you imagine it has a little dial, and your body's going, oh, we're doing weight training, glycogen system. We're doing sprints, glycogen system.
Okay. I like
we're
that
doing,
analogy.
yeah, so we're doing, some HIIT training, and I'll cover this a bit more, so where it gets a little bit tricky, but I'm doing HIIT training at a certain intensity, glycogen. I'm walking around the house, fat. I'm walking the dog, fat,
You haven't
and
seen my dog. That thing's running.
well, and then there's that, but that's essentially the sort of the two
Okay.
energy systems, and what we tend to find in particularly those like triathletes, road cyclists, they have this metabolic flexibility to kind of tap into both. So when they're sitting at a certain power, they are sitting at, say, fats. They can burn a certain amount of fat at a certain amount of power, and then a little hill comes, for instance, and they have to put down a bit more power. The body goes, oh, we're putting down a bit more power, boom, and it just flips over, starts using carbohydrates for fuel, and then we can come to rest. And that's why, if you look at, I don't know if anybody does follow the Tour de France, but if you've ever seen in the Tour de France, you'll see how some water bottles have got labels on and some don't. That's because some are just plain water and some are carbohydrate solutions. Because once again, if you start ingesting, a lot of, potentially a lot of carbohydrates, then your body's going to want to try and utilize that. So essentially, if they're sitting at a fat max power, and they're just cruising along, they're burning fat and oxygen. They don't need to unnecessarily take on any more carbohydrates, but they might need to take some electrolytes, or they might need to take some water on, because they don't want to flip that metabolic pathway over
Oh,
to start
interesting.
using.
So using the bottle, the incorrect bottle, would give a marker to the brain to use the wrong system, potentially.
Potentially, yeah. So,
That's
once
interesting.
you start, ingesting, say for instance, a lot of carbohydrates, your body's going to have to, break this down. It's not necessarily that it sends a signal, but for instance, if you're not utilizing carbohydrates and you're consuming them, and maybe you consume too many, um, this is going to sound a little complicated, so I'm going to try and
Yeah,
do
please, for the sake of me.
yeah, I'm gonna try and do my best here. So when your body, this is the reason why carb max is super important to find out. Like, how many carbs can your body actually burn per hour? Because you'll have all heard this argument: oh, consume 100 grams of carbs per hour, consume 120, and you'll be as right as rain. Not necessarily. Any excess carbohydrates or any excess carbohydrates, your body has to metabolize that. And here's the easiest way to describe it. See all that excess carbohydrates that you can't consume and utilize? It turns to lactate. So if your body's ability is, say, 70 grams of carbohydrates, and you're taking on 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour, the rest of that just turns into lactate. Your body cannot produce it, so it goes straight to lactate. And guess what happens? You end up with lactate levels that are detrimental to performance. That's why you need to be really careful in terms of how you consume and utilize carbohydrates. So I'm cautious of where we've just gone there. I want to bring this back. That's your energy systems. Aerobic is fat and oxygen. Anaerobic is glycogen. That's the way to think about it. Anaerobic system uses type 1 muscle fibers. The anaerobic system uses type 2 muscle fibers. And then in terms of how do you effectively condition these two energy systems? Well, for instance, let's look at the aerobic system first. You do long, slow distance. Everyone's heard of it. Long, slow distance. Zone 2 training. Now, Zone 2 training has become a pain in my ass, if I'm honest. Because everybody wants to talk about Zone 2 training, and nobody... I don't really like to use the zone models that everyone's referring to, which is the Kogan zone models. It's zones 1 to 5, and they call it Zone 2. Zone 2 training should be your effective ability to utilize fat and oxygen to provide the power output, in terms of cycling, So if you're going to go and do zone training, it needs to be at a power that is so low. And one of the arguments I get from a lot of my athletes is, Jamie, this is like ridiculously slow. I'm like, yeah, it should be. Your fat max system isn't developed. Like, the only way we're going to develop it is if you actually work it and stress it. So it has to be at a power output that's, low, that your body's going, we don't need carbohydrates for this. We just need fat and oxygen. And you've got an abundance of fat. You've got more fat than you'll ever have carbohydrates, which is the reason why it's a good fuel source.
What, naturally in your body? Like, it's not
Yeah.
like you have to eat avos before you go and ride.
No, it's indefinite.
Okay.
It's indefinite.
Oh, wow.
Indefinite. You could, and this is also regardless of body composition as well. To some extent, you have an abundance of fat there that can provide energy for power. Because once again, bringing it back to how do we provide power? You can provide it mechanically or metabolically. So, and then it's like, okay, but how do we increase fat max? Well, you can do a couple of things. You can essentially do fasted training, which we've all heard of. And then once again, that forces your body's ability to utilize fat. And what I would always say, you've got to start really slow with this stuff. You can't just go out and try and do, a 2-hour ride, 3-hour ride, for instance, fasted. You're going to struggle. So always start a bit slower. Then you can do purposely underfueled rides. These are fantastic. So you can take on protein, and you can take on, maybe some coffee or something like that. That's not a problem. And you go out riding, you do some anaerobic intervals in there. So maybe you put like 4 sets in there, like 30 seconds. That completely depletes all of the muscle glycogen that you have stored in the muscles. Your liver's going to be more or less empty as well, because you haven't taken on any carbohydrates that morning. And then you go and do like a long ride. That then is going to help you develop your body's ability to utilize fat as a fuel source. That's the aerobic system. Now, once again, you also still need to condition the anaerobic system. So this is where testing is super important. Like I say, you have to know what is your anaerobic threshold. What is the point or a power output or an intensity output at which your body burns the most amount of carbohydrates. It's the same with fat. You have to know at what power output or intensity does your body burn the most amount of fat. And once you've got those two numbers dialed in, you'll have a heart rate, you'll have a power output, for instance, or a wattage output, should I say. And then you start working at that power output, slightly below that power output, and slightly above that power output. And I'll be honest with you, they're actually relatively quick to respond to training. It's not like you need a crazy amount of time to kind of get these things. Around about 6 to 7 weeks of, decent work will help develop both of these sort of energy systems. And it's the same with your anaerobic system. So you would do anaerobic intervals, threshold training, sub-threshold training. That's the type of training that will help you develop. So things like 2x20s, 3x8s, 4x8s, 2x12s. In terms of intervals, that's where we can really then start stressing the glycolytic system and stressing the anaerobic system and get it more conditioned and more developed.
And when you say 2x8s and 12s, it's 12 minutes, correct?
Yes, minutes.
Not 12 seconds. Everyone thinks, minutes. I can handle that.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the best sprints when they're under 30 seconds. Anything 30 seconds and more, as we spoke about it in the opening of the show, they're horrible. But I'm not trying to steal the thunder there. I think you've really explained it well, but you used threshold this and that, but you said anaerobic. So that's as a layman's term, the interval side, where you do different lengths and different rest periods in between those at different intensities, but higher than aerobic, to really sort of build that side of the
here's a better way. Actually, your anaerobic threshold will most likely, or should be, below your VO2 max intervals. VO2 max intervals will always be higher than anaerobic intervals.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and the reason, and this is the reason why. So, for instance, if we look at a standard set of VO2 max intervals, I would say the gold standard right now is actually 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, and it should come at a ratio of like 1-to-1. You can mix around with ratios and make the rest slightly shorter and all that kind of good stuff. But for the simplest bang for buck, best thing that you can do, steady warm up, 20 minutes, 5x5 intervals. That's 5 minutes on at VO2 max power, 5 minutes on at recovery. Do that for 5 sets, cool down for 30 minutes. That's going to be at a power output, like I say, slightly above anaerobic threshold. Now, you would think, if you look at what we call LT1, LT2, which is lactate 1, lactate 2. I want to rephrase this now. This is the problem with anaerobic threshold. A lot of people have often debated, well, what is anaerobic threshold? And actually, there's still some, I'll be honest, there is still some very like-minded individuals out there that believe anaerobic threshold doesn't exist. And actually what we're looking for LT2, which is lactate threshold 2. This is at the point in which your lactate levels have gone above 4 millimoles, because we know anything beyond that, you're not going to be able to clear it. It's just going to be detrimental. So that's a fixed point via your blood, if you like. But a lot of these anaerobic threshold measurements that we see are built on algorithms based on functional threshold power, and they're just a mile off where they actually need to be. So whenever we refer to anaerobic threshold, always act on side of caution, in the fact that, to be honest with you, there's a lot of people in the science community think that it doesn't exist. And there's a lot of people that do, and there's a lot of people try and justify it. One of the best ways to look at anaerobic threshold, like I say, would actually be something like maximal lactate steady state. That's essentially what it's meant to be. That's at the point at which lactate rises, but is now steady. Your body is in a steady metabolic state right here. This is maximal lactate steady state. Doing intervals at that output will condition your glycogen system. It'll make you better at carb utilization. It'll push back your lactate thresholds. And you're still using some oxygen consumption. You're not using peak oxygen consumption here. So there is still some, oxidation going into work there and into play, but it's mainly carb driven. Does that?
I think I'm hanging on you by a thread.
I know.
By a needle. So when
Pun
you
intended.
deplete the glycogen, if I've understood correctly, that's when the lactate forms. Is that the correct terminology? Probably not.
No.
But you said you got like this lactate threshold. I'm like, hang on, you're losing me here.
Right, okay.
So you're trying to build up a better lactate threshold, meaning moving it so that you can do more at a harder threshold before you cause yourself those cramps and where you've just depleted the glycogen. Correct?
So, yes. So if we look at anaerobic
not
threshold,
bad. I'm trying to stay on top of this. It's like being in university, and I never went to university.
No, mate, you're doing good. You're doing good. This is always the hard part. It's like, how do we articulate this well enough? So, if, for instance, you think, it's like I did say, one of the key characteristics of a downhill athlete would be their anaerobic threshold or their maximal lactate steady state.
Yes.
I always use anaerobic threshold because everybody understands what anaerobic threshold is. If I start saying maximal lactate steady state, people are like, what is this guy on about?
They are definitely lost you, yeah.
Yeah, so maximal lactate steady state is what anaerobic threshold is meant to be. And that is a metabolic point at where lactate has risen, but is stabilized. And it's exactly what it sounds. It is a steady state. So you're not incurring any more lactate where it becomes detrimental, and you're not losing any lactate. You're at this point in time where that is a bona fide threshold, right? So if you wanted to improve your maximal lactate steady state, i.e., let's call this 250 watts. So at 250 watts, your lactate has risen and it becomes steady. It's not rising anymore. It's not getting any less. It's not getting any higher. So how do we then push that point in time further back? So if you imagine 250 watts is here, and ideally you want to be 300 watts, which is here. Yeah, you can do that anaerobically. So you can work anaerobically. So you'd work close to maximal lactate steady state, 250 watts. So you either do intervals at 250 watts or slightly above. So call it 265, or slightly below, call it 237, 240. And you do your intervals, and those intervals usually come in the form of 3x8s, 2x20s, 2x12s. There's a whole plethora of different anaerobic threshold intervals. But the key component here is those intervals are only useful to you if the zone modeling is correct. And this is where I think there's a huge problem. Because if you're basing your zones off of functional threshold power, well, chances are you're either 20% over where you need to be or 20% under. So therefore, if you're doing anaerobic intervals, you might actually be doing something like VO2 max intervals. If you're doing VO2 max intervals, chances are you wouldn't be able to complete them because the power output will be too high. But then vice versa, it could be 20% lower. This is how inaccurate FTP is. It's ridiculous. Because when you think you're doing VO2 max intervals to improve your aerobic system, you're actually working anaerobically because you're most likely working on anaerobic threshold. And then vice versa, you're working on anaerobic threshold, but you're actually nowhere near threshold. So this is why the testing element of it is super important. It's got nothing to do with the workouts. There are hundreds of workouts out there right now that are scientifically, backed and proven to improve VO2 max, anaerobic threshold, lactate profiles, neuromuscular power. They're all very well validated, very well researched. They are only as good to you as your zones are set. If you're basing zones of FTP, my opinion would be to just not bother. It's the honest opinion. I know that's ruthless, but...
No, I mean, That's fair. You'd rather have the honest opinion. And if we bring it back to people, aspiring athletes, obviously they're gonna get maybe some testing. And what about the guy that just wants to have a little bit more fitness and fun at a local enduro, or
Hmm.
he's into his downhill and he's doing these weeks and he's like, oh, I need to, I feel like training a little bit better. I understand you are a coach, but you're not everyone's coach. Like you said, you can't
Yeah.
just take your word for it. You can't just
No.
listen to the podcast and be like, I heard I need to do 5x5s. But is there a way to just, I mean, that would be cool, is to help us all, me
Oh,
included, to be
totally.
like, okay, you're not trying to win a world champs. I understand that. You might never hire a coach, but let's give them something to work with. Like, okay, well, when you have a week and you have 2 or 3 sessions, why don't you divide them up by this? I understand I've put you on the spot there. And
No, no.
the guy needs to get tested, number one, if he wants to be serious about it. He needs to allocate, like we did. How much time do you actually have? And then you can build a program. But spitball with me. The
Yep.
aspiring weekend guy wants to have a little bit more fun or smoke his mates after doing some secret training. Those are the best. I've been busy
Yes.
working, and then you smoke the guy because you've been doing some training.
Of course, everyone loves secret training. We all have that one friend that never trains, but we know he
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
So very simple. Go to Google and type in critical power. You'll get a critical power test. There's also a number of critical power charts available on the internet. So this is crucial. It'll tell you how to do a critical power test. All it is a series of intervals. There'll be 3 intervals to do. One will be short, for instance, it might be 20 seconds. The next one might be 6 minutes, and the other one might be 12 minutes. From that, you'll get something called critical power. Then you now have a sort of benchmark. So this is like in terms of training zones as well. This is for those that want to or have access to like a watt bike, a turbo trainer, or anything like that. This is for those guys. You'll have critical power, and then once again, type into Google, how do I work my zones based off critical power? Those zones are going to be far more accurate than FTP, so you're in a better place already. Then how would I structure my week? So there are 2 ways, very, very simply. I would go to the gym one day and do a full body. So it'd just be a full body gym session, working on multiple muscle groups. I wouldn't go overly crazy with the exercise sort of order. I'd maybe have, somewhere like 5 to 6 exercises in there. I'd probably do something like, you can't argue with squats. Squats, everyone should do them. So you maybe have some squats in there, some bench press, do some split squats, pull ups, and then maybe some, bent over rows and glute bridges. Very, very simple. I'd keep the rep ranges. I'd probably keep the rep ranges at around about 8 to 12. And as far as sets go, I'd be doing sort of 4 sets for each of those. So basically 4 sets for each of those exercises, 12 reps. The reason I say that is you're going to get some strength sort of benefits from that, but you're going to get a muscular endurance effect rather than a sort of all-out strength session, if you like. And muscular endurance, as we know, is super important to riding. Then what I would do, if you're inclined to go to the gym, I would then spend, the next time I went to the gym, I would row for 25 minutes, run for 25 minutes, and jump on the bike for 25 minutes. That's 50 minutes, zone 2, steady state cardio. There's 2 sessions. And then if you do have the time and you've got the time for a third session through the week, the third session should be something like an EMOM, an AMRAP. So an EMOM is every minute on the minute, and AMRAP is as many rounds as possible. Once again, this is going to be focusing on muscular endurance. It's going to be high intensity. Your heart rate's going to get up. And I would just look up EMOM or AMRAP workouts. And then on the weekend, ride your bike. That is it. That means that you're getting one full body strength session. You're focusing on your aerobic system, and you're focusing on your muscular endurance and anaerobic system. And then when you go out and ride your bike, ultimately, most people are riding trails. You are going to be working your aerobic system. You're going to get some time on the bike. You're going to sort of be conditioning the legs. That's how I would do it for pretty much everyday rider, the everyday hero, the everyday athlete. That's what I would do with them.
That's wicked. And then say you've got a little bit more time, you've got your own schedule, you can sneak out a few more rides. So in the week you can sneak to the gym, but you also I got 2-3 rides. Then we could start working in some of these other interval sessions on the bikes.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, once again as well, like it's you could very easily structure your own training. In the deep winter months, like where I am now in Scotland, riding in December is going to be pretty grim, and riding in January is going to be pretty grim. In February, you can potentially start getting back out there. So maybe through the months of the dark winter months, maybe you spend 2 months just doing what I've just said there. You go to the gym 3 times a week, and you don't do any intervals here. You just go to the gym 3 times a week. One is a strength session, one's an aerobic session, one's an anaerobic session, and you ride your bike on the weekend if you can. If you can. And the aim of the game of the ride on the weekend is to keep your heart rate relatively low, between that 130, 140 beats, other than when you come back down the hill, because we all know your heart rate's going to get a bit higher. But as long as your average heart rate over the session is fine, perfect. Focus on that for 2 months, and then maybe after 2 months you go, you know what, I've done this now for 2 months, feeling pretty good, and I want to start adding some intervals into my life. And then in terms of doing interval sessions, and say you do have a bit more time, VO2 max intervals. It's bang for buck, the best thing that you can do.
Yeah.
So, and once again, you really don't have to get like incredibly complicated here. Like, trust me, there are so many VO2 max workouts out there. It's unbelievable. There's Lisbon step downs, hard starts versus non-hard starts, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 40, 20s, 30, 30s. We can go crazy here. 3 minutes, 8 minutes, like there's a whole bunch. Keep it very, very simple. Actually, depending on discipline. If you're just riding trails, focus on 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, times 5. Nice warm up, nice cool down. Do those twice a week. 8 weeks later, you'll be a different animal.
That's
if you're a downhill rider, do 40 20s or 30 30s.
Oh, those hurt.
Yeah, I know. They are brutal.
30 seconds. You think, they're the shorter intervals. It's like, nah.
No.
Hang on, actually, before we go on maybe the state of downhill and anything I may have missed, VO2, gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
Go follow some of these other people like Peter Attia, the longevity doctor, Huberman on resilience. Like, there's so many cool things that I think you've mentioned that we really only we didn't speak enough about them. But VO2 max is, can you describe what the feeling would be like if you don't have a power meter, you don't have a heart rate, you don't need that. You just hear, hey, I want to feel better about myself. I want to be healthier. I want to be a little bit more fitter on the bike. So you're going to do these VO2 intervals, which I need to get back into as well. So
yeah,
it's as hard as you can go to sustain 5 minutes. Like, if you go as hard as you physically can, and then you know that you're making less power in the second minute, you've started too hard, correct? Or how would you explain someone that's new to VO2 max intervals?
So if you don't have a power meter, and my advice would be get a heart rate monitor at least. And if you don't have one of those, then the only way you can, and I do this with some of the junior athletes who don't have either or, is you have to kind of rely on your own rate of perceived exertion, if you like, RPE, right? So it's like, how hard was that 5 minutes? If you say 10, the chances of you repeating that 5 times probably going to be slim to none. So what you're looking for, and this is something else that's crucial with VO2 max intervals, regardless of heart rate, power, or just doing it off how you perceive that effort to be, the effort should be achievable. So that's something crucial. Everyone hears about VO2 max intervals being the most horrendous thing they can do, and they are difficult. There's no getting away from the fact they are, regardless of it, they are super difficult. But what you are essentially aiming for is an effort that you can sustain for the 5 minutes, for the 5 sets, not just for the one set. If you go out and, let's just say you go full gas and somehow you're able to survive that first set, and in that next 5 minutes, you cannot fully recover, and you go again and you get a minute in and you just pile in and go, I can't do it. You've gone too hard. So it wants to be at an effort and an intensity where you You know it's hard. You'd be breathing extremely difficult. You wouldn't be able to hold a conversation. So you wouldn't be able to have a conversation with yourself. I would also say that while there'll be some internal dialogue going on, you know, your body will be screaming for you to stop. You should be relatively focused on the task at hand as well, though. So it shouldn't be, you know, you should still be able to sort of, I guess, focus. There'll be some internal dialogue going on, and you'll be breathing extremely heavy. You won't be able to hold a conversation, and your legs should hurt.
Yeah. And two things I'll add, and you can correct me. Avoid looking at the watch too often or too early. Because it sucks when you're like, oh, this is so hard. Can't have much to go. And you're like 45 seconds in, you're like, whoops. So that's one little like hack. And then would you say if you get to the fifth one, and this may happen, and maybe you should be more cautious when you get to the fifth one, and you're like, I think I'm making more power than the first one by a heap. You've potentially gone not hard enough, and you will learn that happy medium, as you said. But there will be some internal dialogue, and you will feel better afterwards, especially after the fifth one. You just need to get to about the third one, because then you know, oh, I've only got 2 left. You know, and then the mental positivity comes back, and you're like, oh, okay, I've got less now than I had when I started.
Actually, the third one is when I'm usually feeling sorry for myself.
Yeah. But as soon as the third one's done, I think you go, okay, I got 2 more. I can get this done, right? Yeah.
I've been there a few times. I mean, look, I'm making these faces, but yes, they are ultimately they are achievable. Yeah. And I think that's the thing to understand is it's not like an effort that you cannot do. It should be an effort that you can do. It just wants to be really hard, you know? And like you say, have a good, for those with phones, and maybe you want an interval app. I use something called Timer Plus with some of my younger athletes that don't have, like I say, watches and heart rate monitors. Timer Plus, you can download it. You can set your interval duration. It'll just give you a nice beep when you need to go, and it'll give you a double beep when it stops. But definitely use that. And once again, think of a better place and you shall be there. That's my only advice to you.
That's brilliant. I want to hear from everyone in the comments if you've gone and done one and what they were like. And if you've done a few, come back to us and tell us. Picture this. You're shredding the gnarliest trails, wind in your hair, adrenaline pumping, and then it hits you. You need to tame the beast below the belt. That's where Manscaped comes in. With their cutting-edge technology and precision engineering, you can groom with the same confidence you take on those downhill descents. It's the holiday season, folks. For some, it's the most wonderful time of the year. For others, it's just another round of dodging awkward questions about your love life and trying not to look like you just crawled out of a cave. Enter the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra by Manscaped to save your dignity this holiday season. Don't be that family member who shows up solo and scruffy to yet another holiday gathering. Get your overgrowth under control with a Weed Whacker 2.0 and let the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra help you seal the deal. Whether it's at the office party, a family dinner, or your next big adventure. Join the over 11 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped to help keep their grooming game strong. Head over to manscaped.com and use the code MOVINGTHENEEDLE for 20% off and free shipping. Now, we've all been there, and if you haven't, consider yourself lucky. You're about to groom in places you'd rather not talk about. And oops, you've got a grooming mishap on your hands. Not with Manscaped. With their design built to reduce the risk of accidents, you'll groom with confidence. And it's waterproof, so you can use it in the shower too. The Performance Package 5.0 Ultra is your ultimate holiday helper. It's everything you need for below. The waist maintenance. It takes care of those rogue nose and ear hairs. Think of it as your seasonal survival kit, keeping you clean, confident, and ready to crush cuffing season and every festive gathering ahead. And here's the best part. The Performance Package 5.0 Ultra doesn't just stop at the essentials. It also includes 2 holiday bonuses. The Boxers 2.0 Midnight Bravo and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag. These premium extras will make sure you're always ready to jingle and mingle, whether at home or on the go. So if you want to look and feel your best out on the trail or outshine your weirdo uncle who's still rocking that goatee from 1985 and claim your spot at the top of the sibling power rankings, Manscaped is for you. As I said, get 20% off and free shipping with the code moving the needle at manscaped.com. That's 20% off and free shipping with the code moving the needle at manscaped.com. Stay on top of your grooming game and be ready for anything the season throws your way. You know what's interesting is you've obviously been following the sport enduro and downhill, but specifically downhill, we can kind of see that a lot of courses are shortening to the 3-minute mark for broadcast. What does that make you think of as a coach and working with the athletes? So, normally you were tailoring these guys. Some tracks were 4.5 minutes at Fort William, Mount St. Anne as well. And now you're like, okay, there are less tracks on that longer side. I can probably answer like not a lot is changing because VO2 is so important. but what is changing? Are you adapting a little bit to some of the shorter, more high intensity races?
Yeah, I mean, it does pose a really good question, as to how I might sort of structure or restructure or prioritize some of the training. I guess the ultimate thing here would be you're probably going to want a higher rate of force development. And I know that's a big fancy word, but
I was going to say
so
English,
you're
please.
Going to want the athlete's ability to get to a peak power. So, i.e., how many revolutions of the cranks does it take for them to produce the highest number, rate of force development? I'd probably put a bit more time and attention back on that, as the tracks are going to be shorter. So you're going to want to make sure that every time they get a crank in, you're going to want to make sure that those cranks count and that they're getting, the ultimate sort of wattage, if you like. That will come at a detrimental effect to the aerobic system, though. So that'll need to be finely balanced. And then other than that, I wouldn't change anything, because obviously they're going to be short and sharp, right? We know that they're going to be short and sharp. 3 minutes. I mean, 3 minutes is still. You think about a 3-minute VO2 max interval. It's still a long time. So you're still going to want their aerobic system to be good. You're still going to want the anaerobic system to be developed. You're still going to want good lactate profiles, because if it's not, they'll just incur too much lactate and it'll ruin their performance for them. But yeah, I'd probably tailor the peaking phase of the program to include more, power specific training, for instance, whether that be sprints on like the watt bikes, start doing things like power cleans, power snatches, all that kind of good stuff, more plyometrics, get those type 2 fast twitch fibers working more effectively and focus on that.
And that's closer to the season, probably, right? Like anything, there's phases of the training. Super fascinating, because obviously they had the semi-final, which they're going away, and it's back. It's changed to what I was coining the LCQ, but some riders are going to be forced to still do those 2 high intensity runs back to back, and to me that makes us full circle back to VO2 max. You just overall fitness needs to be way better. Your cardio needs to be better, and I personally think we've spoken about it quite a bit, but it's easy to do that. I think Greg's was one of the, for lack of a better term, fittest athletes out there. From the old school training before the strength came in, he added this strength component, which was potentially, say, a weakness of his. But that didn't just suddenly make him go from a top 5 rider to winning. He was already winning. It was just adding to maybe something that he wasn't focusing on as much back in the day, because there was less knowledge of what little benefit that could have, and we can't really isolate exactly what's doing what. You've got your theories, and you're doing a lot of work to get those publicized, which is going to be awesome. Like, that's why it's exciting. We could go on forever. I can't wait to start reading some of these papers, and I connect you to some other coaches. Like, the more you guys talk, the more you can share this information for the greater good of the sport. So, what strikes you about downhill in 2024? What impressed you?
I mean, just downhill is impressive in general. I mean, I'll tell you what didn't impress me. I don't understand how it's not an Olympic discipline just yet. I don't want to, maybe that's going a bit too much off topic, but don't understand how we can have breakdancing in the Olympics and and not downhill, given just the sheer technical component. Like, I think for the outside world, they don't realize just how incredibly talented and technically savvy you have to be to navigate a World Cup downhill track at the speeds these boys and girls are doing. So just seeing some of the younger guys, obviously like Ronan and stuff like that coming through as well. Just seeing them perform the way they have. But then I think ultimately looking at Luik's a mystery, isn't he? Like I would love nothing more than to just have one conversation with that bloke, just to see. I just need to know, right? That's going to be like my life's, work and ambition, because once again, I feel like he's just always so consistent. He just has this ability to turn up and do whatever. He never, I mean, maybe it's just me as well, but he never looks chaotic. He just always looks poised and controlled. And I think that's one of the sort of characteristics of, of the legends of these sports. If you look at Aaron Gwyn, if you look at Greg Manat, I think Loic Bruni has his right to be up there, in my opinion, by now.
I agree. I 100% agree that his world champs record and now reeling off the overalls, I think that hurts him, the way he focuses on the overalls for race wins in a season sometimes. Like you've got Amaury that wins a bunch of races to win the overall, and Loic seems like when he gets a race win done and then he gets in a hunt, he manages the season so well to win the overall. That's what I perceive it to be. But I agree, he's certainly one of the great. Will he get the most wins like Greg? I don't know if he'll race long enough. Now there are more races per season, and maybe there's a year where he focuses more on race wins like he does for world champs. But he's an incredible athlete, and I think mentally one of the greatest, if not the greatest. He's doing things that Nicolas Voulieus, the great Nicolas, was able to do, and we all thought he was an alien. It's like, well, if he's an alien, what does that make Loic to have that many world championship titles at the age that he is? And I think he does. His riding style is certainly composed from the outside. He mentions it doesn't quite feel like that all the time. And world champs, he was certainly able to push himself just past the limit, and went down. And I think that's the current state of downhill is not a 99% run wins a race. These guys, and Greg's mentioned it, they're turning up, going 105% all the way down. He mentioned that back in the day, there were sections they would decide to go hard, but then they could kind of link other sections. And then when Aaron Gwyn came and some other riders, was like, no ways, man. We're going high intensity from the first beep to the finish line, So I think the intensity of the sport, these young guns willing to risk a little bit more for that paycheck, and then the depth of field. I mean, it's just amazing. But I think Loic's the epitome of marginal gains over time to how he's become who he is now, right? He's already speaking about his weakness in the rain, and it's like, well, maybe stop speaking about it, because you do pretty well in the rain, now you're making it like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But you can see these great champions are never satisfied. They're never happy with their performance. They can always improve.
And I think it's crucial. And I can't remember the exact conversation I was having, but I don't know. I think we might have touched on this before, and I think I've touched on it with Alan Milway, and a couple of others. But you have talent like Jackson Goldstone, like Ronan. You have these young talents, right? Like talented riders, and they burst onto the scene, and they're just amazing. They amaze everybody, right? And everyone's like, "Guy's the future. This guy's gonna, these are the future of the sport," and they definitely are. But do you not think it's amazing how people like Greg and like Loic can still compete with them, though, even though they are these really young? And you know what it's like to be that young. You feel amazing every day. You can crash and bounce, and you can get up, and you can kind of take the hits a bit better. Mentally you're just more robust. But for people like Greg and like Bruni and some of the older guys that are still up there on the World Cup circuit now, to still be in and around the mix. I guess one of the questions I have is, does talent get you so far? And then is after that, is that just commitment, dedication, discipline to get you to Aaron Gwyn's level, to get you to Greg Bernard's level, to get you to Louis Bruni's, level? Like talent will get you there. And we've seen that in the form of Jackson Goldstone. And then does his dedication, discipline to this sport, to his own career and development as an athlete, does that then take him to the levels that we're just speaking about? I don't know.
I think you have to have all of it. I think talent can only get you so far, and you keep getting told you're talented. I think that can be a bit of a recipe for disaster. We've seen a lot of talented people not make it. Now, I'm not saying you have to sacrifice everything to get to the top of sport. It's not for everyone. Someone like Josh Bryson, one of the most talented person I've seen on a bike, with work ethic and an incredible carefree attitude, but it didn't fulfill him, and he went through some injuries and stuff. But to answer your question, yeah, I think you need all those components to really stay there and to become an Aaron Gwyn. The sacrifice, the doing hard things, doing the boring, mundane things. After a few years, there can be a lot of boring things you have to do to just stay at the top. But you didn't mention the word experience. So I don't know how you define experience, but I think Greg's experience of when to peak and what part of the track he can execute to his skill level and what part he can't, I think has been huge for him. And he talked about that and knowing himself. And that's critical, is the experience component of knowing, like, track doesn't quite suit me, but I'm going to go find sections that I can really push. And maybe it's not my weekend and Loic takes a fourth, but he's still in the title hunt, right? So I think experience, they say you can't buy it. And you certainly can't. It's earned, it really is earned.
You have to put your 10,000 hours in, isn't it? And
yeah, and totally. I love that book.
I think just something else that's kind of always been on the back of my mind, and I know once again this might come across controversial or whatever, but I don't think we race enough. And what I mean by that is, if you look at, for instance, and I know it's maybe the wrong sort of analogy to use here potentially, but if you look at road cycling, you look at a professional road cyclist, look at how many races they do, per year. Look at how many races they do.
What do they average, you reckon? What do you have? It must be in the 20s or what?
Hundreds.
Races?
Like something like...
What, like if you include the stages or what?
Because, for a lot of road cyclists, they have like the whole winter race in cyclocross, right? So, they have like a cyclocross championships. They have local cyclocross events that they enter in. They usually do like the Tour of Giro, the Tour de France. Then they've got world champs, there's different sprint disciplines that they'll enter in. Some of them will do mountain biking events, marathon events. So like, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit there, but without officially looking into it, they're averaging, I would say, at least 50 to 100 races, at least. If you add it all up, it's just that, and I'm not saying that's what downhill needs to do, but I've always liked how road races, in particular those that race road, they will almost all do a cyclocross season, So during the winter, rather than winding down, they finish one race and then they jump into a cyclocross season all winter, and this gives them this. Yeah. It's like they're never out of that racing edge. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing, but part of me wonders if, and this was something
Don't you think physically they're probably in a better spot? Like they're always quite sharp physically, and then they can taper and peak for certain things. Like the best way to train is a race, right? Like when I was a kid, you do cross country and stuff. It's like, well, I'm never going to push myself that hard on my own doing intervals sometimes. So race works. So I understand what you're saying. I guess the catch-22 with downhill is like the stress and sometimes risk for injury of like getting to a race. The bike's got to be set up. You want your mechanics. So it's a little bit harder to always race. But I do think up and coming people and people wanting to improve should be racing more, putting themselves in uncomfortable situations. And remember, there's always a goal that you should be looking to get out of a race, especially in
Yeah,
the preseason, right? And that's why the experienced guys don't do so well in
yeah.
preseason
No,
races
no.
because they know it's not worth the risk, but they're there to test. They're
Mhm.
there to get reps. They're there to get bike time.
Yeah, I just think,
So I hear you. I think it is a challenging sport to race a lot, but we should race
yeah, and
more.
then this kind of once again brings us back to understanding the demands of our sport. We just don't understand enough about it, So it's all right. It's easy for me to say, well, maybe we need to race more. Maybe racing more becomes too detrimental. Maybe we race less. Maybe it's too detrimental. We don't know. And I just do think though, because it was
Mm.
the same with enduro. Like for instance, enduro, like what was it, 6 rounds? Like 6 rounds is not enough. You are barely getting into that frame of mind. Like this is something else that, like, not to bring it back to the psychological component, but you're trying to get into this elite racing mindset, that those feelings, like I said, the only way you're going to condition your mind is to feel those feelings of being on the race line, being in the startup, right? Like, and if you're only experiencing that 6 times a year, that's honestly, it's not enough. Straight up, that's not enough. And even if you do the little races, chances are in your head you've already said to yourself, well, that's a B race, so I'm not really that bothered. And you kind of show up half-assed, and it is what it is type thing. But maybe we need more grade A sort of events, if you like, or racing, so that the athletes can spend some more time in that mental zone to help them better prepare for a more challenging season, I think is what I'm getting at. It's not. I think.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And if I was speaking to athletes, I would definitely suggest, and like you say, maybe say this isn't a B race. Let's get some reps in. Let's get some reps in for the mind. It doesn't matter if your body's not quite there. It doesn't matter if you're in a
Mm-hmm.
training cycle. But I want you to mentally switch on for that
Yeah.
race run, and we score the mental scorecard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Over the time or over that. Yeah, no, I certainly agree. And well, the episode before this potentially, I always forget the timing of these, was Clay Harper from the
Mm-hmm.
Pro Downhill
Mm-hmm.
series in America, relaunching that. So that gives the Americans, and you can see the
Yeah.
reps they're getting in leading into a season, and a lot of those youngsters breaking out on the World Cup circuit. So that's going to be
No, it,
interesting
it
for
it is,
sure.
and this was always my. And now I know this is once again this is going to be another controversial topic. We'll try not get too lost in it, but
Please.
this is the reason why I kind of did like e-bike racing. Okay, and there was only a couple of problems that I seen with e-bike racing. The power stage, in my opinion, just needed to go. And what it should have just been enduro, for instance. Right? It should have just been enduro, but done on e-bikes, right? And I know a lot of people will be questioning, yeah, but they've got a battery, they've got a motor, blah blah blah. It in my opinion, all that doesn't matter. But more time on track, more time racing. Like, they could have filled out the week so much better. You can use it as pre-sighting lines for the. I would have had the e-bike race first, and then going into like the normal bike, for instance. And I would have had it, whether or not you wanted to have e-enduro slightly different tracks. Once again, I wouldn't have bothered. I'd have had them race it both same tracks, e-enduro, one day's rest, boom, into enduro. They would have got 12 races this year instead of 6. It's just more time racing, more time to test the technology, more time to push the bikes. Because I do think, once again, like, this whole e-bike technology is getting a bit crazy. 800-900 watt-hour batteries, trying to create these bigger batteries, when, once again, not too many people are going to like this, but yes, I have an e-bike, and I have a sort of lighter weight model. I think not only are they the perfect training tool, but you could have so much more racing and reduce the risk of, if you like, overtraining by using e-bikes. So have them going from stages 1 to 2, using the power of the motor, if you like, to get them there, and then they're just focusing on the downs and having a day rest, and then going and doing the full thing the next day. It maybe wouldn't be as physically taxing or physically demanding, but there's more racing, there's more opportunity for, in my opinion, better development of both the athlete and the sport and the bikes.
Yeah, it's interesting now because they've fully canned it, right? Yeah, I did have some chats, but I don't recall exactly reasoning from both sides. But yeah, it's almost interesting if enduro came about because those are the bikes that consumers were buying, and it's a participation sport and it has its place. Very difficult to broadcast, you know, very very difficult to package. And then e-bikes like are clearly here to stay, and more people are moving over, my brother included, to that's his only bike currently. So if he wants to go and have some fun, or we eventually decide to enter, like, it would probably be an e-bike class. It's quite interesting. I know I must actually dig into it a little bit more. I know some guys gave me some of the reasons, and I don't know if they couldn't get all the manufacturers to agree on certain things, or what the challenges were. I wasn't in the room, so I need to actually ask those questions a little bit more and actually get some more
Yeah,
information on
but
that.
that's what I mean. Even if there was a way to, I do think broadcasting's obviously always going to be the big issue, isn't it? I mean, it's always going to be the problem. It's how do you broadcast something like enduro? I can understand that it's very difficult. Well, actually, we can actually say it's very difficult, or we could look at what the world rally guys are doing. And
Yes.
is there something to do there, or maybe this is just a prime time to bring back four cross, because four cross was once cool. I don't care what anyone. It was cool. It was
uh,
one of the best disciplines, in my opinion. I loved it.
yeah, I think when the tracks were good, there was an exciting period of it, definitely. Um, and I can see why. It was a headache for all the organizers. It was the money, and follow the money, I guess, and the motivation then dwindles. Yeah, I think it came up before. I was like, I am surprised. I saw a world where
Hmm.
it took off. I did
Hmm.
see that world. So yeah, it is odd.
No, I do. I do have fond memories of it, and once again, I just kind of think it gives the athlete more racing time. This isn't. It's just more racing time. They get to go shoulder to shoulder. And it used to be the day before the actual downhill was. So they kind of get to go shoulder to shoulder with some of their, foes, if you like, and get a bit more racing done. And I guess the risk to sort of the physical reward there, it wasn't as physically taxing, although you could say it is, but it was usually pretty short, and it was just a fantastic way to do the weekend. I loved going to Fort William when I was a kid and watching both the Fort Cross and the downhill. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, as a coach, I think the sport changed a bit, and it became so focused. If you got a good gate start, and then the changes to the tracks happened, and it became a little bit more
Hmm.
closer to BMX, and thus we saw riders having to specialize. And the minute some downhillers said, I'm going to focus on the downhill, then you're looking over and you're going, well, if he's focusing on the downhill, that he might have an
Hmm.
advantage, and my focus is downhill. So off you went back to downhill, and then you left the four crosses to become its own sport with a lot less crossover. So I think that's kind of how the cookie crumbled there. But Jamie,
Yeah.
this has been fascinating. Thanks for dumbing it down for me, and you've got my head spinning. Hope everyone else enjoyed it. Maybe it's got them thinking a little bit more, and it's awesome to see the passion you bring to mountain biking. And if there's anything I've missed, I'm sure there's a lot. But as we wind down, I don't know if there's any topic you were like, oh, I wanted to definitely communicate about that, or articulate is a nice word for dumbing it down for me.
No, I think once again, look, we could talk, forever, surrounding, understanding better both the demands of our beloved sport and how we train athletes. But I think that is a series of podcasts rather than one
Hmm.
long dwindled one, because you can get quite caught up. And I guess I would just like to finish this with, you know like, if you're struggling to kind of understand, your training, and what's good and what's not, and what's beneficial and what's not beneficial, you know do not be afraid to just do a little bit of research. Go out there, have yourselves a little look. Don't be blinded by social media, because there is some terrible advice on social media at the moment. And I hate to say it, but it's from both the fitness community and inside the sort of mountain biking community. Now that's just the internet, and that's just the way the internet is. But my advice to anybody out there, if you are just struggling with training, you want to find some more information out, don't be scared to look. There's plenty of available resources, online. And there'll always be people like me, I think, popping on hopefully podcasts like this, and hopefully trying to do something myself where I can provide hopefully a sort of an educational platform for people to better understand how they should be training.
Mate, well said, and thanks so much to you. And they'll find you on Instagram. Is maybe one of the quicker ways to do that. Your handle.
Yes. Yep. Find me at Athlete Optimization on Instagram, and if you have any questions, drop some comments below, and we'll happy to get into a nice little discussion on Instagram as well.
Well, mate, thanks so much for coming on.
No worries. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, my man.
Yeah, and for all the listeners, we've got some big ones coming up in the new year. I think you saw Greg Menard, sneak peek Danny Hart. We'll get back into downhill racing, but I really, really enjoyed that, Jamie. So make sure you follow along. And I think what's cool is you wanting to learn as well. You're not like, this is where I'm inclined to think, but I'm trying to get the data to back it up, but I'm open-minded. Let's have conversations. You and Alan Milway that comes on the pod a lot, apparently had a great conversation. So yeah, thanks again to everything you do, and to the folks out there. Leave a comment, a review. I read them all. I'll do my best to get back to you. Till the next one. Peace.